Hi, it's Alison again from Concepts for Learning. Today I wanted to have a bit of a talk about literacy rotations. A lot of my young teachers are struggling with how to include good reading and writing teaching in a classroom that is full in terms of number of students, but also very full in terms of the curriculum that needs to be fitted into the time they have. And while they're very aware of the fact that they have quite diverse student needs, they're struggling with how exactly to get started on literacy rotations when they need to diagnose their students, they need to group them effectively, they need to come up with all these activities, they don't want to use worksheets because they know it's not effective. And so I thought it was time that we talked a little bit about how to actually get literacy rotations working, especially in those middle and upper primary years, because early childhood classrooms are often designed around that idea of rotations anyway. They often have an education assistant in their room. They're often in a position where their students can play or they can do independent tasks in another space, because that's how their timetable and their classrooms are set up. But as we move into the middle primary and upper primary, things have changed. You no longer have an education assistant, you no longer have the structural setup of groups and lots of hands-on materials that students can be using. So therefore, how do we set up literacy rotations in situations where perhaps your students are not very self-regulated? They are perhaps struggling a little bit in literacy, and therefore whenever you try and sit down with a small group of students, the other students in the class are constantly coming to you for more help. So I thought it was time we talked about some really fundamental elements about how to get this going and then how to refine it as you progress. So it's an interesting situation in which new teachers find themselves, which is that they know the theory, they've been told how literacy groups should work, but when they try and do it in their own classrooms, it ends up feeling like a disaster, and after only a week or two, it feels safer to go back to a highly structured whole class environment where everybody is doing exactly what you want them to do. However, that creates a dissonance inside the teacher themselves, because they know that they want to do this. They want to have a chance to sit down with 4 or 6 students and help them with the things they need, rather than constantly being pulled or pushed to particular students to deal with things like behaviour management. So I think there are a number of things we need to talk about. And I think the first of those is the idea of starting versus finishing. When you start out, it's not going to be perfect. It's not. It's going to be tricky, and it's going to not look the way you planned, and it's going to feel uncomfortable, but that's okay. And it will take a while, but to start easy. So my advice to you would be this: have a look at your week. How much time and space do you have to give to your literacy rotations? I would suggest, especially in an upper primary class, that if you do literacy every day, and let's say you're lucky enough to have it at the same time slot every day, that you use your first day of the week as a whole class day. In that time, you set up the key concepts you're covering that week. You make sure everybody knows what will be in the literacy rotations for the rest of the week. You do the groundwork for anything that your students haven't done before. So if you're going to ask them all to work with sentence building activities, but you haven't done sentence building activities in class before, then you need to teach them how they work and what you expect from them and what their finished products would look like on that first day. Then, as you work into the rest of your week, have a look at the sessions you have available. Now, the tricky part of this is there's no perfect answer. I've worked in schools that have 40-minute sessions. I've worked in schools that have 55-minute sessions. I've worked in schools that have 63-minute sessions. Don't ask. But the reality is that however long your sessions are, you have to think about what you need to do in that time. So if groups are going to swap their rotation on any given day, that takes time. So for example, if I have a 40-minute session every day, I would probably only do one rotation on each day and a 10-minute introduction or plenary, or 5 minutes introduction, 5 minutes plenary, and give myself 25 minutes in the rotation. So over a week, I would see 4 different groups, and I would make it so I only had 4 groups. However, if I have an hour a day, then I might say, well, actually, I will do 2 rotations a day for 3 days, and I will have 6 different groups rotating, and I will give myself a 5-minute introduction to get everybody on task, remind them of what they need to do, 25 minutes with the group, 2 or 3 minutes to swap over, 25 minutes with the second group, and then a few minutes at the end to draw together what we covered today and where everybody got to. And that would allow me to have 6 groups, and I would see them all over the course of 3 days. The reason I suggest this for middle and upper primary, rather than that everybody rotating through in one day, is because the concepts you're likely to be covering are likely to be more complex. And as such, you don't want your students to have 5 minutes, get started, and then finally get their rhythm with what they're thinking about and then have to move. You need them to have time to think about the idea. You need to have time for them to finish the amount of work you've given them. You need time for them to have tidied it, done the reflection that you want them to do, or whatever else you're expecting. And half an hour is a good time for that. 25 minutes, 20 minutes. That's a reasonable amount of time for that expectation. So once you've had a look at your week and you've decided how many groups you're going to aim for and how that is going to be structured over the course of your week, then you can start to think about what rotations you will use. One of the big questions that new teachers often ask is, but how do I group them? I don't have a strong diagnostic that tells me a lot about what they're doing. I've only just started with them. I don't really know who's got which exact problems. I completely understand. So that would be the next thing I think you need to think about is how will you group to start? Now, the reality is that your grouping in a perfect world would be very, very specific. It's not a perfect world. You're new, you're starting out, you don't know yet. So here is what I would suggest. Depending on whether your focus in your rotational literacy groups is reading or writing, I would suggest that you start with one element you're looking at. So, for example, if you're starting with reading, decide whether you want to look at fluency, comprehension, using key elements within a non-fiction text. Choose an idea that you want to look at and then give students an opportunity to show you what they can do. So if it's in reading, perhaps give them a short text. If you're looking at fiction text, give them a short story. If you're looking at researching, give them an article on the topic you're researching. And then give them a chance to tell you what they understood from the text, to summarize it, to write down some notes, to do whatever it is that you want to see how well they can do. Then based on that task, look for commonalities. As you read each student's work, go, these 5 students don't know how to use headings and subheadings to find information. I need to work with them on that. These 5 or 6 students were able to copy out the key ideas, but were not able to paraphrase it and write them in their own words. I need to work with them on that. This group actually did quite well, so I'm going to give them something to extend their ability and give them a more complex text that we can work on as a group. And base your groups on the exact skill that you have identified that those students need. Now remember that grouping does not have to stay constant week to week. So consequently, if you look at those groups and go, actually, I don't think that group will always be together, that's okay. They're together for this week, maybe they're together for next week. And maybe after that, when you look at a different part of writing, perhaps creative sorry, we're talking about reading, a different type of reading, perhaps reading poetry and understanding the different use of poetic devices, then you may need different students. Some students who were actually quite weak in using factual text may be incredibly good at inferring meaning from poetic text. And that's okay. You can regroup as you get closer to that based on their skills. That's the joy of literacy rotations, that they don't have to be static groups. That's for if you're looking at reading, I would perhaps suggest that's the way to approach it. Additionally, you may have done some Pinnell and Fontes testing, and you may have been able to identify particular commonalities that different groups have, or students who are at a particular reading level. And so you want to work with them in a guided reading context on interpreting text at that level, building their vocabulary, understanding, and making sense of those texts. That works well too. When you come to writing, and I think writing is an area where a lot of us become caught up. You're okay. Go play. Kenj, go play. Where a lot of us get caught up in the conventions, because it's very easy to mark conventions. It's easy to see if punctuation is incorrect. It's easy to see if spelling is bad. It's easy to see if handwriting is not legible. It's easy to see if we have used poor word choice. But writing's more than that. Writing is about expressing content. It's about understanding who you're writing for and what you're writing. It's about being able to engage the people you are choosing to write for. It's about understanding purpose and text type and being able to use the language or the ideas or the techniques that make that form effective. And so sometimes I think we need to be very careful to separate those two out and actually look and say, well, what is my focus within a writing context? If people can't understand your writing because it doesn't make sense or because the punctuation is so poor that there's multiple meanings that could be taken from it, then yes, you need to work with those students on how to make their meaning clear through using punctuation. But if the writing itself is perfectly understandable but the spelling's not great, well, that's not a writing issue, that's a spelling issue. And so I would suggest when you're choosing your writing groups that you give students a chance to write for you and write something that they care about. And so if you're looking at imaginative texts, give them a diagnostic assessment, not a test, a chance to sit down and write that you get to look at, and give them some prompts, because often the tricky part for students is actually coming up with ideas. So say to them, here's a picture, you can write what that brings to mind. Here are some story starters, you can use those to get you started. Here is a soundscape that might help give you some ideas about where to start. Here are some key conflicts you could use as ideas for your story. Or you can just write a story that you have in your brain that you want to share. And let them write. Not 20 minutes and then nothing, but let them write for an extended period so that they can think and they can plan and they can get something on paper for you. Then, the same as we did for the reading diagnostic, sit down and go, what are the commonalities? Which students had trouble with setting the scene and the context, but actually were pretty good with plot? Which are the students where you read the whole story, but you have no real empathy for the characters and you don't really know much about them? Which are the kids who started out like dynamite? They gave you a great start, you knew the characters, you knew your setting, but then it ended up like an imaginative recount because there was no conflict. Group your students according to the skills you need to teach them. And that's what the benefit of literacy rotations is, because then you get to sit with that group of students and say, okay, we've got this lovely text that you started. I really liked the way all 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of you got the introduction going. I can really feel where your story's going. But we need a conflict. So what's the problem? What's the issue that is going to keep me wanting to read to find out the solution? How are you going to keep me intrigued and engaged? And then you need to explicitly teach them different ways to do that. What kind of conflicts work? What kind of stories do you enjoy reading, and what were the problems in those? Can we use some of those problems? Are there some main problems that actually help get stories moving? And that's what the guided reading and writing session is about. It's about you being able to deal with small groups to help them move forward on their journey where they're at. And so if you have found something to work with each group on, it makes your planning incredibly easy. Because once you know that that group of 6 students that you're going to sit with on a Tuesday in the first session all need to work on plot, well, then you might, over the next few weeks, work with them on how do you plan out a plot? How do we build that mountain of intense conflicts with little steps up to that big conflict, and then how do we solve it? The group that you're working on introductions with, you might need to talk to them. You might need to do some seeds of writing and sit outside and go, okay, now let's write about your senses. What can you hear? What can you feel? How do you feel? What can you smell? And you might need to get them to get more in touch with what they can use to build a scene. These are all things that you can do when you're only working with that 5 or 6 students. If that's their issue, then you can target your teaching to exactly what they need. And that may be building adjectival clauses. It may be building their vocabulary to include words to describe. You may discover as you work with them that they just don't have any words to describe senses. Well, then you have to teach them some. And so by having a group that has a very specific target to improve their writing, you have a very specific plan on what you can do to help them. And that makes planning really easy. It also means that students get your individual attention, and every student gets your individual attention over the course of a week. You will hear every child read at least something every week. You will hear what children are writing and what they find difficult in their writing. They will feel supported and they will feel as if they matter. All because you got that little bit of a chance to talk to them in small groups instead of just to a whole class. So literacy rotations are very, very valuable. And while they feel like they're a lot of work, really the bulk of your planning is only for the 6 little groups of 4 or 5 or 6, or the 4 groups of 6 or 7, depending on how big your class is and how you've decided to split them. So what happens if you have 2/3 of your class that all have the same issue, but you don't want to teach it in a whole class because you know it needs to be taught within a smaller setting to work? That's okay. Then you get the chance of saying, well, okay, those 2/3 are really actually going to end up being 2 or 3 smaller groups. And I can group them according to behavior. I can group them according to the start of understanding and the mostly understanding. Those are all your choices, and those choices are flexible, okay? The way I have found recently is most effective for me in these movements of groups is that before the week starts, I create a bit of a grid, a matrix, and no, I don't do it on a computer, I do it on a piece of paper. And then I will say, okay, this is session 1, session 2, session 3, session 4. Honestly, I then proceed to go, that'll be Tuesday first half, that'll be Wednesday first half, that'll be Wednesday second half, that'll be Thursday or Friday or whenever I next have my rotations. And then I go, okay, how do I want this to work? Well, honestly, this is my weakest group and they need me to help them first in the week because they can't do the other activities until we've worked together. So that's going to be the teacher session. Then they are going to move on to immediately practicing that skill in the very next session because I don't want them to forget it. I think actually the group that needs work on adjectival clauses, which is this group over here, needs to have me the next session because they will have a lot of work to do, and when they get to their writing independent tasks, they should have done that first. And again, they're going to go to practicing that skill immediately after I've worked with them. The other 2 groups, it doesn't matter too much. So I'm going to go teacher and practice. And this is actually my strongest group. So it's not going to matter if I give them the practice at the start of next week's rotation and they can do their teacher task today. So I've worked that out, how I want it to run. Then, as you can see, I have some spaces that need filling. What are the rules on that? Well, as you can see, I like to do a practice directly after they've worked with me. So if they work with me for the first half of Monday's session, once we've finished our 25 minutes together, they will then go and do an activity that uses that skill we've just talked about in their own writing or planning or editing, depending on what we were working on. The other 2 or 3 or 4 sessions, depending on whether you have 4 groups or 5 or 6, I then do tasks that are at their own independent level. That means no one should have to get up and come and ask me for anything. So while the work with me is extending their existing knowledge, the work in those independent sessions needs to be based around the idea that they can manage it completely without teacher assistance. So this is where, when you first start out, I would make those activities things like reading for enjoyment. I want you to have a novel or a non-fiction text or a magazine or a newspaper, and I want you to read it for 20 minutes. In my second rotation, so the next week, that read for enjoyment might become, I want you to read for enjoyment, but for accountability, I want you to use Ozark's reading strategies, and I want you to do a predict before you read, a section of clarifying for any terms or sentences, phrases, ideas that you don't understand. I want you to write 3 teacher questions that I might ask you at the end of that book to find out that you really understood it. And I want you to write a summary of what you read. So you can read for 20 minutes, then you have 10 minutes to do those brief notes, or you can do the notes as you go. So we moved from just reading for enjoyment to reading for enjoyment, but being accountable for actually doing the reading. And how you do that is up to you, but that's one of the techniques I use with my students about being able to predict, clarify, question, and summarize so that we know that they are actually engaging in the reading and comprehending what they're doing. In that other group, this is where I might say, you know what? I would like you to do your handwriting, and usually we use a handwriting book or something like that. I want you to sit, I want you to take the time, I want you to work on your practice. It doesn't require teacher assistance. Equally, I might set up one of the online facilities we have. So I might get them to go online and do a study ladder task that I've already set them, looking at, for example, grammar or looking at sentence structure. Something we've already taught, that I've already shown them, explained to them, made sure they understand it. So for example, if we were doing poetry, in my whole class sessions, I would have covered for everybody what a simile is, what a metaphor is, what alliteration is, what assonance is, what personification is. And then I might set them some tasks to allow them to practice identifying those. So deconstructing a poem, for example, and then perhaps writing 1 or 2 of their own. Not something they need to come and see me about, because we've already done it in class together, we've already learnt it in class together, and now they are having a go with no expectation that it will be perfect, but having a go at seeing how they can find them themselves in a simple text that is easy to manage. Alternately, I may say, we're doing a reading rotation in the first half, we're doing a writing rotation in the second half. Our focus this week is planning. So when you're with me, we're going to work on your plans and look at what you've left out or what you need to build or how we can make them better. When you're by yourself, you will then take the ideas we talked about and you will go and build on them and actually do the writing around that planning. For your independent task, I might get you to deconstruct a plan I made and find the problems with it. And then in the final element, I might ask you to revisit an old plan that you've done before to see what you could adjust. So you can keep all the tasks on exactly the same line, but I find that that's more difficult when you're first starting out. So when you're first starting out, focus on what you're planning for your group and keep the other tasks to things that are routine for your class. Their spelling, their handwriting, their grammar work, and focus specifically on how you plan the group you work with. That allows you to get started without actually having all those hiccups of students interrupting, etc., etc. The other thing that I would suggest is important when you're planning your literacy sessions and you're just starting out is that it takes time to build routines. And so once you've created your matrix, so let's put in, we're going to go after our practice session, we're going to do our handwriting. Okay, and in our other sessions, we're going to do our spelling. Okay, set this up on a PowerPoint slide. Have which group? Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, Group 4. Clearly don't call them that. Call them something better than that. And have a list that says on the PowerPoint slide, so no student has to come to you if they arrive late. Group 1, Alice, Mary, John, Frank. Group 2, obviously Group 3 and Group 4. Have all of your students listed, have all of the groups clearly shown, have Tuesday 12 o'clock, Wednesday 1 o'clock, whatever time you have, so that every student knows where they go, and have this frozen on your screen. Additionally, I usually have, and I have been known to put this on the wall. The reason I do it on a PowerPoint is because my groups will change every week, or every 2 weeks, or every 3 weeks, or whenever I want to change them. So having them all beautifully laminated on the wall is very nice, but it's a lot of work every time you change the groups. The other thing you want is to have a list of task 1, task 2. This is what the task is. This is the material you need to have ready when you move to that group. If you have those things all up on the screen, your students will be able to manage without you. Now, I know some of you are laughing, going, my students won't be able to do that. Well, they won't now. They won't today. They won't when you haven't started yet. And they probably won't do it effectively for the first month. So you have to be patient, and you have to lay out the ground rules, lay out the expectations, and take it step by step. When we are in our literacy rotations, you are not permitted to leave your table and come to see me. And yes, in some of my classes, I have had to add, unless the building is burning, someone is bleeding, or something bad has happened. But coming to me because you do not understand the task is not acceptable. And then you have to give them strategies. You have to explain. If you don't understand the task, what do you do? Your first task is to read what it says on the board. Your second solution is to ask quietly in a whisper the person next to you. The third possibility is to say, I do not understand this task, even though I've searched for help, so I am going to do something else. Now, that something else may be reading a book silently until the end of that rotation. It may be going to a finishing off task that you need to complete. This does not last forever. For the first week or two, there will be some students who will really struggle with this. But as it becomes routine, and as you do the same thing every week, you start to take away those options. You say, no, you know how to do this task. We've done it before. And so, no, you can no longer read a book in that session. Yes, we have students with additional needs who are going to have problems with that, but you know your students with additional needs, and you know how you can work to help them deal with this. And that is how we need to move forward. How do we go from here? Once we have set up this basic path and our students are able to independently manage the fact that we set a timer, the timer goes off, everyone packs their things away, puts them in a neat pile in the middle of the desk and moves to the next rotation station. Or perhaps in your class, the better option is your group stays in that place, everything's put into the basket or box in the middle, and the person who is collector, organizer, manager today takes your box and moves it to the next table, and everybody stays seated. Believe me, there have been classes where both are more appropriate. This technique works whether you are in year 2, I would say even lower, but I've done this with year 10s and year 11s. Year 11s usually don't require me to do all the extra work. But even year 10s often require some support so that I can work with a particular group of students on persuasive devices in essays. And they need my attention, and the others need to be going on with building other skills. They're probably not going to be doing handwriting and spelling, but they might be. You have got half an hour to do research with your earphones on, listening to the YouTube videos I've allocated. This group is in a position where I want you to look at the plan you've written, add in which sites you're going to use and perfect your planning before you go on to write your assignment. And this group needs to be polishing their references, making sure that they have at least 6 references of good quality that are written in the correct format, so that when you come to me and we're looking at persuasive devices, you know exactly what you're doing. I hope this helps in thinking about it, and bearing in mind that our time, we're not always going to be having 3 groups that are using automated systems. We're not always going to have 3 groups working on Ed Perfect and if it was Maths Matific or whatever sites your school uses. Over time, students will be able to sit down and go, okay, so my task is working on sentence starters today. Here are the prompts that the teacher has given us. If that's the sentence starter, how am I going to write my follow-on clause? So at first, your focus is completely on your own group. But over time, you will become better at managing that group and planning it quickly and efficiently. And then you will say, okay, I want to set up a more hands-on task for one of the other rotations. I can spend some time building that resource. I can spend some time searching for really strong syllable activities, and a group will become better and be able to do, for example, play a game of Scrabble, building their vocabulary, and still keep the volume down so that you can work with your other groups. I hope this makes it seem a little bit more manageable, and certainly we can come back and have a look at a later stage at what other kinds of activities you can do in a literacy rotation to build particular skills. Thank you very much. I hope it helped.